Andre Jackson.
And I'm Dave Rader. We're your hosts for this trip into history. Join us now as we tell the tale of Frisco 1522.
Steam locomotives are a vital part of American history. Thanks to volunteer groups like the St. Louis Steam Train Association, the thunder and fury of the steam train has been saved from extinction. The St. Louis-based association operates 1522 as a reminder of a railroad's immense contribution to the industrial age. Returning 1522 to the rails came only after 2 years of tireless labor by dedicated volunteers. Today, 1522 hauls special excursion trains filled with people eager for a taste of nostalgia. For every rider on these trips, dozens more gather at trackside to hear, touch, and smell the wondrous machine. Watch as 1522 races along in familiar territory, Missouri's Ozark Hills along the old Frisco Railway. With the cooperation of history-conscious railroads like the Burlington Northern, which absorbed the Frisco in a 1980 merger, 1522 operates in a modern railroad environment, creating scenes like this as 1522 passes a modern diesel locomotive. The control cab of a steam locomotive like 1522 is where generations of boys grew up wanting to be. Today, volunteer crews work with professional railroaders to safely operate 1522 over rails shared with modern trains. 1522's operation often creates scenes where history meets the present, as in this meet with a modern Amtrak passenger train. 40 years ago, passenger trains like the Frisco's Meteor and Sunnyland were pulled by steam engines like 1522.
I'll give them something to think about.
From the mid-1800s through the first half of this century, American railroads were a primary means of transporting both goods and people. The Frisco 1522 is shown here in Birmingham about 1940. 1522 is a typical locomotive of its day. She was built to haul heavy passenger trains over much of the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway's 5,000-mile system. This railroad, commonly called the Frisco, built 29 other engines identical to 1522. 1522 often ran between Kansas City and Birmingham, Alabama, or from St. Louis to Oklahoma City. Passenger trains in those days carried fancy names like the Texas Special and Bluebonnet. 1522 is a medium-sized locomotive. Overall specifications of the locomotive are shown here. She is about 88 feet long. The locomotive and its tender carrying fuel oil and water weigh nearly 600,000 pounds. 1522 stands 16 feet tall over the top of its smokestack.
Many people today are curious about how a steam locomotive works. The answer is simple. On the 1522, heavy fuel oil, about the consistency of tar, is carried in the tender and burned in the locomotive's firebox to make steam. The locomotive tender also carries 11,700 gallons of water. The water goes into the boiler and makes steam at 210 pounds per square inch of pressure. Steam is sent by the engineer to 28-inch diameter cylinders, 2 of which are located at the front of the locomotive on each side. These cylinders have pistons inside which push the 1522's huge main driving rods, thus rotating the wheels and propelling the locomotive forward. The steam and smoke from the burning fuel oil is ejected through the smokestack as the locomotive travels down the track.
In the late 1940s, diesel locomotives similar to this one replaced the 1522 on Frisco passenger trains. For a few more years, 1522 continued to haul freight until diesels, too, took over those assignments. Diesels replaced steam locomotives because they were cheaper to maintain and operate. This particular locomotive was built by General Motors in an attempt to sell railroads on the virtues of diesel power.
In the early 1950s, 1522 reached the end of the line and was stored at Fort Scott, Kansas. Most such steam engines were eventually cut up for scrap. A few, however, were donated to museums or city parks. In 1959, the Frisco hauled 1522 to St. Louis, spruced her up, and sent her to the National Museum of Transport. The engine is shown here after being prepared for donation to the St. Louis Museum. For more than 25 years, 1522 sat cold at the museum. She was not to remain so, however. In 1985, volunteers of the St. Louis Steam Train Association chose 1522 for restoration as an excursion locomotive. That fall, members began working on the engine. They started by stripping down 1522 on its displaced track at the museum. Here, volunteers are shown in the early stages of disassembly. Metal sheets covering the boiler have been removed, along with wooden strips that supported them. By winter of 1985, the engine's cab had been removed and workers were removing the heavy steel driving rods, which are the silver links shown here between the workers. By spring of 1986, 1522 had been moved to a covered area at the museum. Work proceeded there. Here, volunteers are using a heavy crane to lift the fuel oil tank from the tender. Years of exposure to the elements necessitated extensive repairs to the firebox shown here, as well as the boiler of the 1522. To rebuild 1522's wheels and axles, the entire locomotive was jacked up. Here, driving wheels have been painted with red primer and other items have been reassembled. 22 months into the restoration, in July of 1987, a fire was lit in the 1522's firebox for the first time in nearly 35 years. The steam-up operation tested boiler work done by association volunteers. After the fire was lit, the engine was slowly brought up to working steam pressure over a 3-day period. Safety tests and minor adjustments were made to verify that no further work was required before reassembly. By spring of 1988, workers were putting 1522 back together. The restoration was done with an eye for historical accuracy, but modern materials were used where needed or required. For example, asbestos, once used to insulate steam locomotive boilers, was replaced with efficient modern fiberglass. The larger of the holes visible here is one of the cylinders. The smaller hole above it is the valve chamber that controls the direction of the locomotive's travel by governing how steam enters the cylinders. Here, as was done countless times during the age of steam, fitting of the highly polished driving rods is underway and pistons have been installed in the cylinders. After final assembly, the locomotive was sprayed with primer and later with black enamel. In their quest for historical accuracy, association members painstakingly produced stencils duplicating 1522's intricate gold striping and lettering. As built, the 1522's elaborate paint scheme was based on classic Grecian fretwork. Volunteers reproduced the striping using imitation gold leaf. The engine was now complete down to its polished brass bell and shiny nickel-plated cylinder covers. In April 1988, 1522 moved under her own steam for the first time since the early 50s. The engine was run on a short section of track at the National Museum of Transport. Here, the engine is pulling a caboose donated by the Burlington Northern Railroad, which now operates the old Frisco lines. Burlington Northern has provided much assistance to the association, allowing today's generation to see history in action. It had been 31 months since volunteers began working on the 1522. Looking exactly as it did when new in 1926, 1522 is shown here, ready once again to do what she was built to do, haul passengers in safety and style. On May 7, 1988, on a sunny day at St. Louis Union Station, 1522 was formally dedicated in a ceremony attended by hundreds of well-wishers. On this day, the association formally recognized those who had provided financial or in-kind assistance to the project. The nonprofit association funds operations through excursion trips and sales of souvenir items such as this videotape.
Since 1522's rebirth, she has been used to pull excursion passenger trains in several states. On typical trips, 1522 will haul 12 to 18 passenger cars leased from various organizations. Today, even the coaches hauled by 1522 are historically significant reminders of the glory days of passenger trains. Some of these cars date to the 1940s. On 1522's trips into the world of modern railroading, association members face challenges in servicing the vintage machine. Steam engine maintenance shops, water tanks, and fueling facilities are long gone from today's dieselized railroads. The association has fuel oil trucked in and obtains water from the nearest fire hydrant. Several hundred feet of fire hose are carried on the train to make the job easier. As was done in the days of steam, 1522 must also be lubricated every 100 miles or so, using more than a half dozen types of oil and grease. This chart shows the various lubrication points on the locomotive. Association members are seen here servicing the 1522 during a test trip on the Burlington Northern Railroad. The test runs ensured that modifications to the 1522's wheel bearings were successful. In this scene, the rhythmic noise of a grease gun is heard as crews lubricate driving rods. During the test runs on Burlington Northern, 1522 returns to the old Frisco rails where she once hauled passenger trains. On this day, the engine is pulling 800 tons of freight between St. Louis and Newburg, Missouri, 120 miles away. Enjoy as the Frisco engine traverses this scenic line surrounded by mist and fall foliage. Here, 1522 puts on a timeless display of swirling drive rods and wheels. The blue and white passenger car is the Firefly, the association's crew car. The rebuilt baggage crew dormitory car carries tools, parts, lubricants, and crew members. This car was rebuilt and modified by association workers. The Firefly was built in the late 1940s by the Milwaukee Railroad for service on crack passenger trains that traveled between the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest. Through the efforts of the St. Louis Steam Train Association and cooperating railroads like the Burlington Northern, thousands of people each year experience the excitement of railroading as it once was. Thanks to groups such as the St. Louis chapter of the National Railway Historical Society, recreating passenger trains from yesteryear remains possible. Enjoy now a final shot of the 1522 as the engine makes history on modern rails.